everyone, to another edition of Leaders Lounge. Today, it is my honor and privilege to have with us Mr. Anthony Housefather, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour. He was appointed to this position since his re-election in 2019. Anthony Housefather was first elected as the Member of Parliament for Mount Royal on October 19, 2015. From 2015 to 2019, he was the chairman of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Anthony was first elected to office in 1994. He was initially elected as a municipal councillor in Hampstead, then elected in Côte-Saint-Luc, Hampstead, Montreal West, and served as mayor of Côte-Saint-Luc between 2005 and 2015. He is also a lawyer, and prior to entering public service, he held senior level roles in the public sector. Mr. Housefather, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much, Tony. By the way, it wasn't in the public sector. It was in the private sector.
Oh, private sector. Yes, my apologies, of course. In the private sector where you held senior level roles. My apologies. So I would like to start my series of questions first off on the right to disconnect, obviously a key subject for our members and for individuals in human resources everywhere. For the past several months, the Ministry of Labour has been working on the right to disconnect and undertaking consultations. Furthermore, CPHR Canada has had the opportunity to meet with you regarding this issue to share our views on this matter. And as you know, our members, the chartered professionals in human resources, handle the day-to-day management of work organization, work performance, and the wellness of employees in the workplace. So the right to disconnect is a great matter of interest for our profession. For their benefit, could you please explain what led the government's interest and engagement to pursue work on this subject?
Absolutely. First of all, Tony, a pleasure to be with you and your listeners. And the right to disconnect is something that's become more and more important in a world where mobile technologies have blurred the boundaries between what it means to be at work and what it means to be not at work. And as we all know, during the course of the pandemic, much of what we used to do in the office, we now have been doing from home, and mixing childcare and mixing caring for elderly relatives with work. And it's been complicated for a lot of people. And it's been very difficult for many Canadians at night or on weekends to actually disconnect from the office. And while there are some significant benefits to employers from the fact that they have a workforce that is continually engaging, there's a lot of risk factors there as well. And whether it's mental health issues of employees or whether it's burnout, there's considerable risk from people feeling that they need to work all the time. And we also worry that employers may start favoring those employees that will have the time and the flexibility to respond to work-related issues outside of work hours, which might disadvantage people, particularly women who have young families and childcare responsibilities, or those who don't have the money to have the necessary mobile and devices to be able to work from home. So for those reasons, we started looking at what other countries have been doing, and a number of countries have introduced different policies on how to deal with the right to disconnect: France, Germany, Spain, amongst others. So basically, we wanted to start engaging with employers groups, with labor, with civil society, and determining whether or not we need to have a right to disconnect in Canada to have a better work-life balance for everybody.
Right, okay. Which makes sense. And at this point, could you give us perspective on the government's intentions regarding this? Do you have any clear cut at this point, or it's still exploratory?
Well, as you know, Tony, we created a right to disconnect committee with representatives from federally regulated employers, unions, and others. And the committee was tasked with providing recommendations to Minister Philomena Tassi, our Minister of Labour, with how to move forward. I was part of that task force. We started meeting in October of 2020. We held our last meeting earlier this month, and I really appreciated the time that committee members took to devote to that issue. And we also heard from Canadians and groups representing Canadians like yours through a consultation that we held in March and April of this year. So now that we've held our last meeting, the committee has just provided its final report to Minister Tassi, literally within the last week. And she's going to now have to make a determination on how she wants to move forward. So I have no concrete measures to announce, but we're on the verge of, going somewhere.
Okay, great. Well, as you know, CPHR Canada really endorses less legislation on this matter, but more creating a policy, right? A right to disconnect policy, we believe is really a great tool that government could promote with employers and of course HR professionals in Canada that could then support that and create something that works for both, because it is a double-edged sword essentially, right? And so we're hopeful that the government really will be focused more on policy setting.
And I think that just to be clear, we're very sensitive to the fact that different industries are different and different companies are different within the same industry. And so a one size fits all does not, it does not always work. And I'm very sensitive to that.
Okay, that's great to hear. We really appreciate that. I'd now like to shift gears to harassment in the workplace. Bill 665, as you know, the federal anti-harassment and violence legislation that aims to keep Canadian workers safe in a federally regulated workplace that has been proposed by the Ministry of Labour, came into effect last January. Can you tell us more about the receptivity of organizations to this day regarding this legislation specifically, the mechanisms and the tools that have been put in place?
For sure. And so just for your listeners who may not be as familiar with C65, it basically created a single integrated approach to protecting federally regulated private and public sector employees from harassment and violence in the workplace. And generally, to date, as far as I've heard from employers groups, it's gotten a pretty good reception in federally regulated organizations. Both employer and employer representatives and federal government organizations work closely with the Labor Department to develop the regulations that we put in place. And we've tried hard to create tools and resources to support the new framework. So we're trying to increase awareness on the new regulations. We put in a labor program 1-800 number that's been getting quite a lot of calls in recent months asking questions about it. And so just for your listeners who are in federally regulated workplaces, what they're now responsible for is they've got to develop a workplace harassment and violence prevention policy with the policy committee or the workplace committee or the health and safety representative. That's number one. And they've got to respond to every notification of an incident of harassment or violence in the workplace. They've got to ensure that there's a resolution process that's conducted in a timely and transparent manner, and that a workplace assessment addresses the risk of harassment and violence in the workplace. They've got to ensure that the complainant is protected and provided the options of a negotiated resolution or conciliation. And they've got to require that everybody has training within the workplace. That includes executives. Everybody's got to be trained. And of course, if there is, God forbid, harassment or violence that results in the death of an employee, they have to report to the minister within 24 hours that this occurred. But the government needs to provide support, and that's clear. We can't expect employers to do this on their own. So what have we done to date? We've created a document that assists employers in interpreting various aspects of the Act and regulations. It's called Interpretations, Policies, and Guidelines, and that document is available on our website. There have been an employer requirements checklist that's been developed and provided to federally regulated workplaces. There is a hub, which is a 1-800 number that I mentioned earlier. It links employees and employers with the labor program experts that can help them navigate the code and figure out what to do in their own workplace. And there's also a roster of investigators that is now on the CCOHS website that you can call upon. And the CCOHS has also developed sector-specific training in multiple tools, including posters, information sheets, podcasts, videos for employers and employees that they have on the CCOHS website.
Okay, well, that's actually very helpful to hear, because clearly, this is a huge mandate that will fall on our members and our HR members, professionals in HR specifically, and of course, employers. So I'm glad to hear that the government is looking to offer that support mechanism, because clearly this is new, but it obviously requires a lot more administration than ever before, but clearly on a very important guideline. I'd like to now move, if you don't mind, to discuss transformation of the workplace. As you know, workplaces across the country have been experiencing many disruptions this past year due to COVID, and even before. The world of work was already transforming at a fast pace. The workplaces must adapt quickly and reinvent themselves in a world where there are still many uncertainties about what tomorrow will look like. In your opinion, what are the key learnings and findings that you draw for the extraordinary experience of this past year regarding the world of work, and how is it going to redefine the future of work, given the environment you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to require adaptability. I think the last year showed us that we can be creative and innovative in how we work, and that a lot of the changes that have come about are probably permanent. I think a lot of workplaces realize they don't need to lease quite as much space as they used to, and that they may have happier and more satisfied employees if they have more flexible abilities to work from home. And that you might be able to hire someone in British Columbia when you're a business operating in Quebec or Ontario or vice versa. And I think these are pretty innovative, cool things that are probably here to stay. But I think we've also seen real challenges that we need to address, including in federal legislation. One of them is, for example, the mental health of employees, as employees have not only had to deal with the pandemic, but constant connectivity. We talked about the right to disconnect, but we've had lots and lots of reports. I believe 40% of Canadians said that their mental health deteriorated last year. And for those with pre-existing mental conditions, that number rose to 61%. So there has been an online consultation that we started on mental health in federally regulated workplaces. And the responses are going to help inform proposals that we're going to need to deal with federally regulated workforces and the public sector. We're also going to have to better protect gig workers, because I think we've seen a trend, and I think it's been exacerbated during the pandemic, that we have more and more gig workers who don't have the protections, the traditional protections that most employers have, whether it's the right to pay into EI and receive EI, whether it's long-term contracts that allow for severance in the event there's a disengagement. And we're going to need to figure out how the Canada Labour Code can better provide, an EI for sure, better provide for gig workers. And then, as I mentioned, the right to disconnect is another thing. We're going to have to figure out, for example, when you choose to work after hours, you're not normally considered to be paid. That's not work, work you're doing where there's compensation necessarily involved. And we're going to have to look at these changes to the workplace and whether or not we need to modify the labor code in any way to address them. And these are just some of the challenges. But I think, like most Canadians, we are an adaptable country. In the same way we've risen to the challenge and we found ways now to manufacture most of our PPE in Canada. We're going to be able to develop vaccines in Canada. We just opened our first vaccine facility in my riding, Royal, last week at the NRC. I think we're going to be able to be adaptable in the workplace, and I count on Canadian HR professionals who are going to teach their companies how to be innovative and how to keep their employees happy and motivated despite the changes that we're all seeing.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad you hit on a couple of points I think that are really of interest to us. I mean, you've talked about the right to disconnect and employees not being able to separate, at least in the last 15 months, work from home, because many have worked from home. And the challenge has been, you're kind of cooking a meal and then you kind of see the office there. Let me go check my email, let me respond. And so the day is just hard to capture. It's no longer the 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, typical day. It's been at night, evening, and so on. A lot of employers, I know even pre-pandemic, had policies in place where, employees actually, it was in the guidelines as an example, that if you're working, post 5 p.m., it's on your dime. There's no overtime and so on and so forth. So that's something, as you say, we've got to be mindful of. But there was an interesting article in the Globe and Mail this past weekend about employees and their rights, and more specifically their demands, that employees are demanding more latitude, an ability to work from home more, and also to be able to work anywhere at any time. And a lot of employers, I guess, the savvy ones are taking them up on that, and they're offering these as benefits. And that may be something that I'm curious whether the Ministry of Labor is thinking about how it will adapt with that, particularly if they're hiring beyond our country. As you say, mobility now, there are no borders, meaning that you can hire someone working in the UK for a Canadian firm. Is this something that the Ministry of Labor's got their eye on, and what will they typically do there?
I think we always are considering what happens. Of course, as you know, that the work regime and the employment practices that are subject to a contract of employment are based on the location that the worker is actually working. So a Canadian firm with an employee in the UK is going to have to provide a UK employment contract, right? I mean, you're going to have to be able to be governed by the jurisdiction that the employee is based in. And that's important because I don't know that many of our firms necessarily have employment contract templates for all of these different jurisdictions. I was a general counsel of a multinational. So one of the things that you learn is how vastly different the employment regimes are in different countries, let alone all of our provinces that have different regimes than the Canada Labor Code. But for example, when you hire someone in Norway, that person cannot be hired on a fixed term employment contract. They only have contracts of indeterminate term. So basically, if you think you've hired someone for 3 months, you haven't. Or for example, in some countries, you need to have the contract in the local language. You can't have an employment contract, for example, in Russia that's not written also in Russian with the Russian version predominating. And so all of these things are things where we're going to have to find a way to give tools to Canadian companies, whether through the labor program, which maybe not be the best place, but through some mechanism to help Canadian companies that are suddenly hiring employees abroad.
Right, and it's not as easy as that, because then there's the tax implications. So, where do you pay taxes, both as an employer and as an employee, given where you live? So you're right. It just creates a lot more things to think about for an employer and for an employee.
Whether or not they want to incorporate in that jurisdiction in order to be the employer of record, for sure.
Exactly. You also mentioned, mental illness, and clearly that's been something that our HR professionals have had to deal with, from not only themselves, which can happen, of course, but also employees. And you mentioned that, since the pandemic, we've seen a huge rise. I'm curious whether there's been an affinity or some type of dialogue between, for example, the chief health medical officers and the Ministry of Labor, because clearly, the lockdowns haven't helped. I mean, yes, they've helped in trying to curb COVID, but what's happened is the ever-changing guidelines, the back and forth in some provinces more than others, has put a toll on employees and on mental illness. I'm just curious if there's been any dialogue on that front, because of course, we're hopeful that we're beyond the worst, but we always hear that there's a potential fourth wave coming and so on and so forth. We're seeing it in other countries. Are we ready for that in the event that, employees again see this, oh my God, here we go again, and what's that going to mean for society as a whole and the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, yes, there's an ongoing dialogue between the Health Ministry and the Labor Ministry, and Minister Cassidy has been working very closely with Minister Haidu with respect to the implications on the mental health of workers. So there have been all kinds of online tools for mental health that are available now on federal government websites, both in the Health Ministry, which is where most of them are located, but also on the CCOHS website. When it comes to occupational health and safety, they're also taking on mental health and putting on tools for employers and on their website. And all of those are done in collaboration with public health officials, because of course, we want to run a government based on science, and we want to make sure that the medical experts in mental health are the ones we're consulting when we make determinations as a government.
So true. Well, that's helpful to hear. So I'm just curious, I guess, are there any other main issues or priorities that you and the Honorable Minister of Labor are working on right now that would be of interest to our members that you would want to share with us?
I think so. I mean, I think basically a lot of your members who may be in the federal sector are wondering when the pay equity regulations are going to be published. And I can hint that they're going to be published in the very, very near future. And we listened carefully to what we heard in the consultations and the feedback that we had earlier this year about complexities related to some parts of the original proposal. So hopefully the changes that have been made will be positive and positively regarded by your members. And so that should be coming in the near future. Minimum wage, as you know, the $15 federal minimum wage, or the greater in the event the provincial minimum wage is higher than $15, plus ongoing escalations related to inflation, has been put in legislation right now. The minister is about to introduce an Employment Equity Act task force. We know the Employment Equity Act needs to be revised. I think it was introduced in 1986 or something like that. So it's quite a long ways back. And one of the things we've noticed, for example, is the way groups are lumped together Sometimes you're unable to disengage and say that this group is really having difficulty because other groups within the same group are overrepresented in the federally regulated workforce. So we need to sort of look at that, and also look at groups that are not even accounted for in 1986, like LGBTQ plus Canadians, which have not been included in the act. So we're committed to making that act better, and Minister Tassi is about to announce the appointment of a panel of people who are going to be advising her on that. And I guess the last one I'll throw out there is pay transparency. We finally published regulations in November of 2020, and they're coming into force, and they've come into force, I guess, in 2021. I think it was January. I can't remember exactly, but this salary data will really help, I think, Canada be a leader in pay transparency. So those are just a few of the issues. I mean, there's also slave labor and the issue of supply chains that both Minister Tassi and I are very interested in and very engaged in, that has also been exacerbated by the pandemic, in terms of visibility about where some materials that have come to Canada have come from and who's been using those. They're dealt with through some of our trade agreements like the USMCA, but countries like the UK with the Modern Slavery Act, and other countries that have started catching up to the UK and passed them, it's something where Canada needs to go as well. So that's also a priority for us.
Wow, that's great. Thank you very much for sharing all that. I didn't expect all that. So really nice to hear. So we've got the lowdown. So thank you so much for sharing all of that for us. Really appreciate it. Well, Mr. Housefather, it's been really a pleasure having you today. And thank you so much for agreeing to this talk. I know your time is very valuable, and it really is sincerely appreciated that you make the time to talk to our members today and share in this one-on-one. Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Tony. Have a great day.
You as well now.